Hello there. I'm Andrew Russell with the University of Georgia, and what I've got here for you is an examination of downforce settings at varied planting speeds in peanut, of course. So just a little bit of background. Most traditional planters, traditional vacuum planters at least, are designed around an optimum planting speed of about 5 miles an hour. But what we need to bear in mind is that 5 miles an hour is considering more widespread agronomic products such as corn, soybean, or even cotton here in the South. And we have a lot more challenges with planting peanuts compared to those products, namely because one, peanut seeds are much heavier and larger than, say, corn or soybeans, and two, peanut seeds are much more fragile than those seeds. It's actually quite easy to just shatter a peanut seed between your fingers if you've ever had the opportunity to do so. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You have to be quite careful with them. But for the purpose of this trial, we're honing in on that first challenge that I mentioned, that they are much larger and heavier than normal seeds, because going through the field, as you might imagine, there's a lot of bouncing and jolting of the planter, which might shake some of those seeds off of the seed disc if your vacuum pressure isn't quite high enough to keep them on there. And also, given the super high populations that we're planting peanuts at, that seed disc is rotating quite quickly through your buckets in there, your basins. And especially on single row planters, trying to match that population, it's quite difficult for it to grab a hold of those seeds. Now, twin row planters are generally where the industry is moving towards, but a lot of growers are still relying on single row planting for peanuts. So we are seeing what we can do to help stabilize some of that peanut planting, because of the tight window we have for planting time in peanuts. We generally don't want to be tottering through our fields at 2 and 3 miles an hour much longer. Otherwise, that's when we start to get into late planting for peanuts, and before you know it, tomato spotted wilt virus has devastated your entire stand. And one of the settings that we can control in these planters that we think might help some of that stability is spring-loaded downforce, because as you might imagine, holding extra pressure on top of those row units would keep more stable, prevent that turbulence from reaching the seed disc and knocking those peanuts off, of course. That is the hypothesis, at least. So that leads us into our objective of determining if increasing that downforce at higher planting speeds does improve stand establishment by allowing those seeds to remain attached to the seed disc and into the furrow. And of course, with that higher stand establishment, we would preserve yields at higher planting speeds. So 2021, we had two trials, one in Midville, Georgia, and that's in East Georgia towards the border of South Carolina, and one at UGA Tifton, just outside our campus border. We used a Monosim NG4 Plus 4-row vacuum planter, which is quite representative of the type of planter that's used around here in this part of Georgia, just that normal ground-driven planter. We used a population of 87.2 thousand seeds per acre, and our vacuum was set to 21 inches, just trying to keep in line with standard operating practices of trying to keep 6 seeds per foot. In Midville, the treatments, we had a low, medium, and high planting speed, each repeated at a low, medium, and high downforce. While in Tifton, we had just a low and a high planting speed, repeated at every downforce setting available on the Monosim planter, just to see if we could delineate any sort of finer trends in that downforce compared to at Midville, where we wanted to see more of a broader range of speed. We counted emergence regularly in Tifton, of course, because we're right here, we have the capability to do so. While in Midville, we were only able to get our initial stand establishment and then final stand establishment. And then towards the end of season, we calculated whole plot peanut yield using our peanut combine. Of course, here in figure 1, we see the Monosim in action, getting some peanuts into the ground, just to give an idea of what that planter looks like. And figure 2 we have here on the right shows you where we have that downforce mechanism located and how we adjusted it. We just disarm the lever and move it to whichever slot we needed to. And onto the meat of this whole project is the results, of course. The emergence rate here in Tifton, we didn't see a lot of deviation in the rate up to 9 days after planting, but past 9 days after planting is where we start to see quite a lot of divergence between those two speed groups of 3 miles an hour and 6 miles an hour. And of course, by 16, you'll notice that there's an enormous gap between these two groups with relatively minor variation between all of the downforces. Of course, though, these two higher downforces at the higher speeds are ever so slightly above that bottom baseline where the lower downforces at the high speed converged. But as I'll show you a little bit later, it wasn't quite enough to get it up there to compete with that low speed. In Midville, final emergence was actually quite decent across all speeds. Of course, 50% emergence at 7 miles an hour isn't ideal, but it is still within it's still above what we would consider a replant scenario for a lot of peanuts around here. While, of course, the emergence increasing as speed decreases, just because, as I mentioned earlier, that seed disc is spinning so fast trying to keep up with that population, it really can't grab those peanuts as efficiently as it can at the lower speed. And then the final emergence count in Tifton, every single downforce, regardless, except for these two high downforces at the high speed, there really was no variation across the downforces. Of course, not nearly as big differences between there was the speeds. As you can see, it's basically between 68 to 77% at 3 miles an hour, regardless of downforce, while we had quite poor emergence at 6 miles an hour. And then moving on to our favorite statistic of yield, we actually saw incredibly uniform yield across all of our plots in Midville, and it's difficult to say why we had such a uniform yield, especially given the large penalty to emergence. Even though 50 is still acceptable, that is 30 percentage points from the highest emergence that we saw in our 3 mile an hour groups there. And we think that's partially due to we had some fairly ideal seasonal conditions out there, and with peanuts being a dicot, they have that capacity for compensatory growth. So wherever we had some missed seeds, the plants that were nearby were able to move in and fill that gap. But compared to Tifton, of course, there's only so much compensatory growth can do. And if you have only 30% emergence, or even worse, the lowest emergence we had was 17% emergence, those plants can only get so big before we start to lose yield. And of course, as you can see, there is a quite distinct gap between even the highest high speed group and all of the low speed groups, which are quite uniform. So there is not enough evidence to conclude that increasing downforce offsets negative impacts from higher planting speeds, which we did see that there was an improvement to emergence with the higher downforces, the higher speeds, but that just isn't enough to offset that huge malus. And we cannot rely on compensatory growth to fill in all of any gaps that might occur, as we saw at Midville. That we have to consider that a fluke, of course. So moving towards the future, we're going to have to look at improved metering techniques so that seed disc is able to more effectively grab the peanuts at higher speeds, or look more into the effects of how twin row planters perform compared to single row, and if we can make lower cost alternatives for these growers that still rely on single row planting. I would like to thank, of course, my major professor, Dr. Wes Porter, for guiding me through this project, and all the support we've received from the Georgia Peanut Commission. Without them, this wouldn't have been possible. So I'd like to extend a hearty thanks to them. And I would like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Thank you.